Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis with the Daily Beast. He's their senior columnist.
Friend of mine and friend of America.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for rating and reviewing this podcast. Thank you for supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/Matt Lewis. We have a great guest today talking about a super important topic that we have frequently talked about on this show, China. Our guest is Dan Blumenthal. He's a resident fellow and the director of Asian Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on East Asian security issues and Sino-American relations. He has served in and advised the U.S. government on China issues for more than a decade, and he's the author of a very good new book, The China Nightmare, The Grand Ambitions of a Decaying State. Dan Blumenthal, welcome to the news.
Thank you so much, Matt.
It is great to talk with you, and it's interesting. By the way, for those who are listening who love current events, we are going to get around to talking about Joe Biden and Donald Trump and all that. But I want to sort of start with some history, and you do a great job of explaining the history of China and how that context really factors into their geopolitical vision today. And your subtitle there mentions their grand designs, but the fact that they also see themselves as having problems. And in the book you write, the Chinese Communist Party sees China's geostrategic position as weak and unsustainable, with only one coastline, which is home to the bulk of Chinese economic activity and its major trading ports. China's leaders feel surrounded and vulnerable to U.S. and allied forces stationed in Japan and South Korea. Dan, we don't often hear about China as a vulnerable country, but that certainly would be maybe dangerous, right? I mean, it could be an opportunity for America, but it also is dangerous. Talk about that aspect.
Absolutely. So, as you mentioned, the thesis of the book, The China Nightmare, is they are certainly very strong and very formidable and very aggressive and ambitious, as we mostly talk about. But part of that ambition is driven to compensate for feelings of vulnerability and weakness. So you mentioned one big Chinese assessment of its own vulnerability, and that is that it's got this one coastline. It's a maritime trading nation. It's got all these ports on that coastline, but the countries that are really close to China's coastline are U.S. allies. So U.S. Japan, U.S. Taiwan, U.S. South Korea, and the United States still has a very strong military presence. So part of what China is trying to do geopolitically is to undermine and neutralize the U.S. ability to sabotage or undercut China's ability to go to sea, to trade, to control its own lines of shipping and trade routes. And that is one key vulnerability that if the United States really focused on, we could see we have some room to maneuver in terms of gaining leverage over China.
Right. So it is an opportunity for us. I mean, those of us who are concerned about China as an adversary, this demonstrates that they are not, because sometimes we hear like, oh, they've got, over 1 billion people and their technology is so much better than ours. And we have to realize like they have problems too. And they have problems that some of which were the one-child policy and some of which have to do with their geographic location. But doesn't that make them dangerous as well, right? I mean, so like it makes them maybe, on defensive and militaristic.
Absolutely. So there are really three drivers of why China is acting so aggressively on the international stage right now. First is it's powerful and strong enough to do so, and it senses the United States and the West during COVID we're on our back feet. That's number one. Number two is to try to mitigate these concerns about being vulnerable, being Number two on military power, economic and diplomatic power. And the third, without question, is that Xi Jinping himself feels under siege from within. That it's very difficult for all of us to perceive this, but he faces challenges, he faces criticisms, he faces possibilities of fractures within the party. And that's another reason he's trying to compensate for all that and gain some nationalistic wins. It makes them very dangerous. And that's why it's not just from strength that they're acting out on the world stage right now on Taiwan, on India, bullying Australia. It's also because Xi Jinping needs to really gain control over his party and people who oppose what they perceive as his overreach.
Now, one interesting thing that Xi Jinping is doing is really hearkening to history, and this is something that countries do a lot of the time. Even if it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? They want to invent some glorious backstory, and I guess it's needed for nationalistic reasons to tie their constituents together. But so one of the things that she talks about a lot is this century of humiliation. How important is that history? Even though it's none of our lifetimes this happened, right? But how important is it to have that legend and sort of a chip on their shoulder? It's like Tom Brady talking about being drafted in the sixth round, and he needs that for motivation. Like why are they harboring resentment over this century of humiliation?
Well, first of all, I like that example of not that I'm a big Tom Brady fan, but I like that example. But so I'd say, as you said, many nations use their interpretation of history in the service of current policy. So to motivate your people in China, you keep kind of stomping on this issue of grievance and aggrievement, and certainly even Chinese, let's say, more liberal reformers. If you go to China right now and you say something about Japan, they're very anti-Japan. Part of it is propaganda, but part of it is memories of Japanese colonialism in China during this century of humiliation. But the other number two is more, they actually have a long history, are very historically minded, the Chinese leadership, and they still study very closely their history and their classics of statecraft and strategy. That is a very big deal inside of China. And as I write in the book, in the China Nightmare, they study very carefully times where they have fallen in the past. And that includes the last dynasty, the Qing Dynasty. And that's where the century of humiliation began. Essentially what happened was that the UK, the European countries, Japan took advantage of Chinese weaknesses to occupy and carve up China. At the same time as that was happening, as those foreign humiliations were happening, different groups of Chinese were in massive rebellion against the Qing. Massive. I mean, some people might have heard of things like the Taiping Rebellion, and all of this came after losing war. So China today is still, the thing they most fear is a combination of foreign subversion working with Chinese who are trying to bring down the CCP. That's still a very operative fear today, based in Chinese history.
Which would explain why they are putting Muslims in internment camps and why they're not too keen on like Christianity being preached in China. They do not, they've got enough on their hands externally. They do not want to tolerate any challenges internally.
That's absolutely right. And so the Uyghur issue has been long in the making, as you point out and identify. The initial fear started actually back in the 1990s when the Soviet Union was collapsing, and the fear was that Uyghur Muslims would work with outside other Turkic Muslims throughout Central Asia, all the way to Turkey and try to carve off Xinjiang from China. So absolutely, that fear of outsiders working with insiders in China to carve up China was still extremely relevant to the case of the Uyghurs. Same with Tibet. So the fear that the Dalai Lama, this gentle spiritual man, was going to cause Tibet to break off from, and he was running it all from his home in India. Same is true in Taiwan. The fear that this Chinese culture, which has a democracy, will somehow subvert the entirety of the Chinese authoritarian system. Hong Kong, this is still also, I should finally say that most of the arrests of the very well-known human rights activists that are known to us in the United States, the famous ones, Liu Xiaobo, Ai Weiwei, the artist, the charge that they usually get prosecuted on is working with foreigners to subvert the Chinese nation. So it's extremely, extremely operative, still relevant, germane. That's what the Chinese fear the most.
And again, this goes back to the Qing Dynasty. That's what brought down that dynasty. And I think there's some revisionist history here, though, in the sense that, Xi Jinping harkens back to this dynasty as being this glorious time. And that's, I think, when China had the largest geographical footprint. But you write, the Chinese Communist Party has ensured that this strategic history is not widely known, that the strategic history of how they conquered to get this land. And you continue insisting that China has historically been a peaceful country. The truth is that present-day China is heir to this ruthless, blood-drenched military history, which nearly doubled China's size. Talk about this false image that they like to perpetuate.
Well, sure, Matt. Thank you for identifying that. So even, I've been working in China policy for many years, and I turned to this historical research because I wanted to understand China better for this book. I didn't even know how bloody the conquests were. The Qing Dynasty, and we're talking about a dynasty, so we're talking essentially about the last dynasty, which started maybe 100 years before the American Revolution, maybe a little bit before that. And fell, more or less at the turn of the 20th century. So it's not that long ago. It really is not that long ago. But this Qing Dynasty conquered everything that we now know as China to its west. So Mongolia and north, Xinjiang, Tibet, the conquest of Taiwan was at that time. A lot of revisionism on the Taiwan question. The truth is that Taiwan was, quote, part of China because of a bloody conquest during the Qing Dynasty, that they colonized Hong Kong, all conquered by the Qing, and sometimes in even genocidal fashion, when they were fighting with what we would now known as sort of the Western tribes that made up Mongolia and so on. Nobody knows this because the Chinese don't want anyone to know that. What the Chinese themes today, propaganda themes, which they're very good at, is that China will be a more benign world leader, a more benign hegemon than the United States, because it doesn't have any history of conquest. That's what they say in their propaganda. It doesn't have any history of, they're not warlike people, they're merchants, they have a Confucian ethical order. Ignored almost completely is this warlike history that they have. So for propaganda purposes, they play it down. For propaganda purposes, they say things like Taiwan was always part of China, Hong Kong was always part of China. Not true. It wasn't true. It was part of China through conquests.
And that plays into what they're trying to do today. I forget the term of art, but we have allies, they have partners or something. The insinuation is that they're not going to dominate other countries that they partner with the way that America does.
That's exactly right. So what they talk about in Chinese now much more openly, they don't use the term replace the U.S. alliance system, but that's certainly what they mean. And they say we're going to replace it with a interlocking network of strategic partners, with China at the center. And that's the real purpose behind the One Belt, One Road initiative. And so what they're trying to say is exactly as you put it, which is these partnerships are going to be more equal, more harmony, more fair. They're not going to dominate these countries. Their propaganda is that the U.S. alliance system is the result of heavy-handed neo-U.S. colonialism. Their way is going to be more harmonious, more ethical, more equal. And then they do hearken back to this revised history of times when they were the largest country or empire in the world.
And let me just say, sort of housekeeping stuff here. If you're a reader, it's Qing, the Qing Dynasty. So maybe you've been reading it. It's Qing. And I also just want to say this book is very readable. It's, I've seen other books on China that are like tomes. I mean, I wouldn't even begin to try to read them because it would be like the next 10 years. You've really done a great job. This is just like a normal size book. It's about the size of my book, Too Dumb to Fail. I'm guessing it's like 70,000 words. So it's not intimidating. You can get a history of China that is pertinent and relevant by reading The China Nightmare, but in a way that's very readable and approachable. And I think that's really helpful. And Dan, is that something that you intentionally wanted to do, or did it just come out that way?
Well, it's very much what I wanted to do. So I too like books that are short and to the point and concise, but pack in a lot of analysis and information. And so I worked on it for a very long time. The research took 5-6 years to do the historical research and to do the current research and to go through all the Chinese strategic documents of today. But I really wanted to condense it and go through the history in the service of where they're headed in the future. But I thought laying down the history for people would be really important, but I had to boil it down so, as you say, people could read it. But people could take away the fact that, number one, they are this empire. They conquered many other countries, and uniquely, as I say in the book, they're the last remaining empire that got most of its territories back in the 20th century. But I also wanted to show how this isn't China's first competition. China's competed with great powers in modern times very many times. So they know how to compete. They competed with the Soviets. They competed with us. And now we're in a competition with them again. So I wanted to make it short and readable and accessible while packing in as much information as I could.
And you write, the fatal flaw in the Qing Dynasty was the incessant focus on continental expansionism and the failure to recognize the role that the Industrial Revolution played in transforming the European and Japanese militaries, particularly their navies. By the time the Qing faced the British Navy in the Opium Wars, it was too late. The British decisively won every naval engagement and imposed its will on China. Other European colonial powers soon followed suit. The history has influenced the Chinese Communist Party's strong focus on technological and military strength today, particularly its growth as a maritime power. That is super interesting. I think it just suggests that like so much of what we're seeing take place in China today is based on lessons they learned, and at the beginning of the 20th century.
I think that's right. I think so. There are obviously a whole set of reasons that China has focused so much on becoming a maritime power and focused so much, as you mentioned at the outside, on technological theft, acquisition, advancement. The lessons learned, and they study these things at the top extremely carefully. They study the end of the Qing Dynasty. They study the fall of the Soviet Union. Absolutely not making the mistake again of missing key trends in world development. So the assessment is navies matter a lot. Maritime power matters a lot. Technology advances and China's assessments are everything. In their view, the key to world power is technological advancement, and that absolutely comes from their assessment of why the century of humiliation began. They did not expect, they did not see the Western powers go through the Industrial Revolution, acted extremely arrogant towards them, and they paid the price. So they very much today do not want to pay that price again, and in fact want to be the leader in these technologies and in maritime power.
All right, so I want to focus on the modern times. I want to talk to you about Biden and Trump and China today. But so I feel like I need to get us up to speed, like from this time that we were just talking about, the fall of the Qing Dynasty, to today. I'm going to give a brief, my understanding of what happened, because it has to be brief. But then I'm going to do it, and then you just come in and set me straight on what I got wrong or what I left out. So after the fall of the Qing Dynasty, I guess the next big thing that happens is World War II, and China is ostensibly like on our side against Japan during that. And then afterwards, a civil war breaks out in China where you have the nationalists against the communists. The communists win. You end up with Mao, which I think did a ton of destruction with things like the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution, just horrific stuff. But eventually, unlike the Soviet Union, China decides to open up economically, not politically, but economically. And then in the 90s, you have America recognizing China, giving them the permanent normal trade status. And I think the assumption was that if we open up China economically, then eventually they would also open up, politically. Then we have Tiananmen Square, I guess, happened in the 80s. But so that didn't happen, though, right? So the assumption that if we opened up China economically, that they would become more virtuous and more free hasn't, up until now, has not panned out. And now we finally see that they are really adversaries. Okay, so that's a long, catching us up to speed. What did I get wrong? What did I miss?
No, you got it right. I mean, I think the one thing I would say is that I think this is really important. So if we're thinking about, as we move our discussion into Trump and Biden and current day competition, if we want to learn lessons about how China competes with great powers, its rivals, the period you talked about from when they were in this Maoist dystopia of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution and possible war with the Soviets, you go into 1969 or something like that, years around there. And then about 12, 13 years later, we're their ally against the Soviets. Deng Xiaoping had negotiated that, their Chinese leader at the time. We're their ally in terms of building up their economy and gaining science and technological know-how. Other countries followed suit. Amazing turnabout. We're their ally in terms of staying quiet as they attacked Vietnam because Vietnam was getting too close to the Soviet Union. So the first thing I want to sort of underscore there is they are incredibly agile in shifting geopolitics around in their favor. In that period of time as well, we're studying. The second thing I'd say is you're absolutely right. In the 1990s up through 2002, they enter into the WTO very much with our support. And then we don't really notice, but we now know that right after 2002, they start to reverse the economic reforms. They start to bring the state sector back, really much more socialism, and they start to reverse any legal and political reforms as well. There's a lag time, so we still think they're booming, but they're reversing these reforms, and they're turning slowly into the state that they are right now, which is much more dictatorial and slowly much more aggressive on the world stage than they had been in the 1990s. So I think you got it exactly right. I think the antecedents of, of where they are today, though, began at the beginning of the 21st century. We just didn't see it.
How much of that do you think was always them playing the strategic long game, that they were feigning openness with America to basically buy themselves time, so that they could eventually become our rivals? How much of that was like intentional and strategic all along versus just the way it played out?
A lot of it was intentional. So they were never turning into economic liberals who wanted a free and open free market system just for the sake of the principles of free market economics or just for the betterment of their people, although they wanted to better a lot of their people. But in 1989, of course, Deng Xiaoping, who was a great economic reformer, cracked down harshly on political reform and protests at Tiananmen Square. So they still were authoritarian thugs at the time when it came down to it. And they started to build up their military after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they saw how powerful we were in the first Iraq War, and they saw how powerful we were in all the various skirmishes we fought in Kosovo and elsewhere. And that really scared them, and they really started to build up their military at the time. So I think a lot of it was intentional. As we know, strategy is always hits up against realities and shifting politics, and that was true in China as well. But a lot of it was intentional. A lot of it was, let's build up our economy and military power in this fashion, keep the United States complacent until we make a turn to be able to actually compete with them at a peer level. But what I don't think was intentional, though, that more had to do with the pressures on Chinese internal politics, was the reversal of these economic reforms, because it has put them in a much worse economic state.
Now, it seems like fairly recently, just during the Trump administration, probably due to his tariffs, it seems like only recently that we have really viewed China as an adversary. It's a matter of degrees, of course, but it seems to me like this is a fairly recent, not development, but a recent awakening that we've had. But when actually did we? I know Obama talked about a pivot to Asia, as opposed to being concerned primarily with the Middle East or something. I'll ask you personally, when did you realize that China was, maybe probably our greatest geopolitical rival?
Well, I'm a bit of an outlier here because I wrote in 1999 that they're going to take over Taiwan, and we have to do something about it. And then I was in the Pentagon working on China and Taiwan and Japan in 2001 to 2004 at the Department of Defense. And I was extremely concerned with some other people about China's military modernization. So I sort of knew they were going to become a big problem for us, authoritarianism with military power and other types of power. But I think in terms of people who really changed the direction of our China policy, you say, okay, well, there are people certainly in the Obama administration talking about a pivot, talking about how we really have to focus on China and Asia. That's where our future is, and that's where the greatest challenge is. There certainly were people in that administration who felt that way. They didn't carry the day. But President Trump, you got to hand it to him on China. He changed. We are now debating China on President Trump's terms. So he felt in his gut for a very long time that in his way of thinking, they were cheating us. They didn't have our best interests at heart. American workers were terribly hurt. Manufacturing, kind of economic, business minded. But he opened up space for people like the Secretary of State Pompeo and others who were more geopolitically minded to say, well, it's not just economic. I mean, they are making great strides in Southeast Asia, in Taiwan, military issues, technological theft, bullying of other countries. So we definitely, President Trump definitely changed the way I think all of Washington talks about China now, which is it's a competitor. It is getting a little bit more zero sum. They want us out of Asia. They want to be on top. And I think those are the terms that Biden inherits. And even if he wanted to, it would be very difficult to jettison much of Trump's approach.
Yeah, I want to stick with Trump for a little bit because I feel like it's really hard for me to understand Trump in China. I mean, it's like almost schizophrenic, right? Like on one hand, he tweeted like congratulating China on like the 50th anniversary of the Communist Revolution, which, strikes me as just the kind of thing that you shouldn't do if you're the leader of the free world. I can't imagine like Ronald Reagan doing something like that. Like if you believe in moral authority and human rights, it seems bizarre. He talks all the time about how much he likes Xi. He also, got out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have, as far as I can tell, that would have actually really isolated China and been a very good check on China economically. So he has rhetoric that boosts China. He has taken at least this one big trade decision that I think helps China. On the other hand, you have the tariffs. You have him talking about the China plague. Is it just me, or is it really hard to understand what his philosophy is toward China?
It is difficult to understand. Let me say one thing. Imagine if you're sitting there in China trying to understand it, right? So you're Xi Jinping, and he invites you to Mar-a-Lago and talks about what a wonderful cake you're having together and what a great leader you are, and so on. Meanwhile, he's deliberately showing you that he is bombing Syrian chemical facilities while you're in Mar-a-Lago. As soon as you leave, he's tweeting out how we had a good meeting, but if you don't improve on certain economic issues, I'm going to impose tariffs. He's improving relations with Taiwan. He is sanctioning people who were involved in both Hong Kong and Xinjiang. His government's making a case against the state-owned enterprise telecommunications equipment manufacturer Huawei, which then sanctions it essentially. I mean, she's completely confused. He talks one way, but the policies are extremely tough. So this has completely confused China. I don't think that's a bad thing. I do agree with you that the rhetoric about the Communist Revolution is just not something we ought to be doing. But it confuses Xi even more because Secretary Pompeo, National Security Advisor O'Brien, then go and make these speeches about basically the evils of the Chinese Communist Party at the same time. So there is a lot of confusion, but the net result is the policies are much tougher. I think Trump thinks more like a businessman and a deal maker, and we get a bad deal from China, and he wanted to get a good deal and thought that he could, and that explains some of his rhetoric. But yes, it has been, while the policies themselves have been tough, the rhetoric coming out of Trump about China, about Xi Jinping, has certainly caused confusion.
Do you think this is Trump intentionally trying to perpetuate a madman theory that keeps the Chinese off balance and scared of him? Or do you think this is Trump the man tweets what he feels at the moment, but his administration is actually keeping him in check, and the administration is following a coherent strategy, even if Trump isn't?
I think it's probably a bit of both. I think that he does not think these are actually good people who have American interests at heart. and he very much, I mean, this is a guy who put tariffs across the board on China. If we were talking 3 years ago and somebody said that everybody's in the United States is going to be okay with across the board tariffs on China, we would probably be laughed out of Washington, D.C. and other power centers in the United States. So this is a guy who wants to make China pay a price for economic malfeasance and other activities he doesn't like. But he also, at the end of the day, thinks in terms of deals. So that's partly to gain leverage in order to get a better economic outcome. What happened is he became convinced by many of his advisors that there was more resistance to China that was necessary, and he accepted that. But again, the unpredictability sometimes undermines the coherence of the strategy. So when it comes to some of the economic pain he's inflicting on China, the question is always, would he reverse that had he won a second term if he thought he was going to get a better deal?
Well, you mentioned tariffs. I mean, obviously, free market fiscal conservatives, just philosophically believe that tariffs are just, it's bad policy, that essentially tariffs are just taxes on American consumers. On the other hand, I think it's pretty widely acknowledged that China manipulates currency and sort of cheats at the game. And then, I mean, lastly, I think that you could make a pretty good argument that America has an interest, even if it isn't the most economically sound thing to do. America has an interest in protecting American industry, if nothing else than for national security reasons. And so this is a big argument, or a big civil war taking place, I think, still within the conservative movement. What do you think of the tariffs? I mean, do the tariffs actually hurt China, or does it just get passed, sort of priced in and passed along to Americans?
The tariffs absolutely hurt China in many different respects. One is they're still really dependent on export into the United States. And so across the board tariffs on Chinese goods that are supposed to come into the United States hurts China's manufacturers. And Xi Jinping even admitted as much when the U.S. and China were in economic negotiations before the phase one trade deal that was signed last year. The tariffs were hurting him. The tariffs were hurting him politically as well. I mentioned earlier in our discussion that there's backlash against him inside the party. There are people who say Xi was too arrogant. He should not have angered the United States in this fashion. And the tariffs are a tangible price that Xi has brought on China itself. So the tariffs definitely hurt China. I think you're absolutely right to say that we are going to be having this debate in free market circles and other circles about how to deal with China's massive dislocation because of bad economic practices of American workers and American manufacturing. This debate is not going anywhere.
So what would you say to, and I mean, I'm sure at AEI there are free market absolutists, what would you say to someone who's just a free market conservative who just fundamentally disagrees with tariffs across the board? What would you say to them to convince them that in the case of China, this is actually not a bad policy to pursue?
I would say, number one, national security concerns trump economic concerns when push comes to shove. Not that I'm siloing the two, they're connected, but we're not dealing with Europe here. We can criticize Trump's tariffs on Europe, but we're not dealing with Japan, an ally. We're dealing with a country that's trying to undermine us, and it's trying to undermine us through economic competition, very bad economic practices. It's not a free market economy by any stretch of the imagination. it's done things to really hurt Americans, American workers, and so on. And so there's a point in which even Adam Smith would say free markets need to pause when it comes to national security concerns. So I would say, but I am a free market person, and I would say there needs to be limits on the amount of intervention by the U.S. government in markets. And the next phase that I think we really need to go to is really, really identifying those areas where China is competing unfairly that matter the most to our national security. And a lot of that will focus in on certain technologies where we need government intervention either to control our exports or to control our investments into Chinese companies. So I think the debate, we got everyone's attention. Trump got everyone's attention in terms of taking on China in this blunt manner. The debate has to move to very targeted U.S. government interventions to protect our national security and economic security.
I just want to go back to something I mentioned earlier, which is the idea that opening up China would, inexorably lead to political freedom. The idea that trade and economic freedom and, entrepreneurism would ultimately, cause China to either for there to be a revolution or for China to grant political freedom. And that just hasn't happened, at least not yet. Some people still hold out hope that in the long run it will. Why were we wrong about that?
Well, we were wrong because we didn't take ideology seriously, which is always a big U.S. mistake. So we didn't take the fact that the Chinese Communist Party has a ideology. It may not be communist anymore, but it's very socialist. It very much believes in state power over economic freedom. It very much believes in the power of that the Chinese Communist Party should remain in power no matter what as the single authority in China. We didn't pay attention to the movements inside China in the early part of the 21st century to reestablish party control, fears of China that the United States was going to spread democracy everywhere, and it was a threat to the CCP. Fears China had of the color revolutions in Central Asia and the Arab Spring in 2011. We didn't pay attention to how China was reacting to those things, how much an authoritarian government committed to the existence of the Chinese Communist Party was going to fight back against what it thought was attempts by the U.S. and the West to undermine it, even in a soft fashion.
I mentioned the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which I think was a mistake in terms of isolating China. Do you agree with that? And was that just, if you agree, was that just Trump just reversing an Obama era policy because he doesn't like Obama, or was there actually a rationale?
Well, so there's a rationale from a free trade point of view, which I don't think Trump or Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who also reversed herself on TPP at the time, I don't think they were coming at it from a free trade. She was coming at it from the politics in the United States about trade. He was coming at it because he's not a free trader. But so there were some free trade problems, and there were some questions about whether China could enter into the TPP too easily. But that's not what their concerns were. Their concerns, and Trump's concern, was he really believes, wrongly in my view, that trade deficits are the right measure of prosperity, and that we would run up more trade deficits with countries entering the TPP, and wasn't convinced by the geopolitical arguments that if you have a really decent trade agreement with emerging countries like Vietnam, as you say, you do isolate China. So his motivation was his view of economics, which is more zero sum, and Secretary Clinton's motivation at the time was, look, people in the United States, important constituencies, have just turned against trade.
Yeah, I had forgotten about Hillary, but that's a good reminder. It sounds like it sounds like, generally speaking, you think that Trump has done a good job with China. And I'll just say personally, I'm a critic of Trump, but just the fact that he has changed, I think, the American public's consciousness about this, that we now view China a little bit more skeptically, more as a rival than we did 4 or 5 years ago. I think that is, I mean, it may be an unpleasant realization to have the scales fall from our eyes, but I think that is a good thing, that we are aware of the threat that they pose. But I don't want to mischaracterize you. Do you think, if you're grading Trump on China overall, what grade would you give him?
I would say, a B plus. So I'd say that absolutely taking on China in this fashion, calling it a strategic competitor in our main national security and defense documents, signaling to our bureaucracy that unthinking engagement was over. We were going to compete. Our military was going to compete. Our economic agencies were going to compete. I think no Democrats in Congress really argued the point. None of them were really calling vociferously for the end of tariffs or for the end of sanctions on certain Chinese technology companies. I think, again, our relationship with Taiwan is at its best in many ways. Although he gets a lot of criticisms about the way he speaks about alliances, a lot of them are happy with his strength on China. So, but of course, there's a lot more work to do, and Joe Biden, who said we need to focus more on alliance relationships, has a chance to bring more people along on this idea that we need to push back against the worst of Chinese behaviors. But it's not going to be easy for him to do so, because you have to really pressure allies who have economic interests in China to take tougher stands. So the reason Trump definitely, like I said before, we are debating China on President Trump's terms. Joe Biden is going to be responding in many ways to Trump's policies and deciding what to keep and what not to keep. He'll probably keep a lot of it. But we could do better on the alliance front, and on rhetorically some of the things that you mentioned about cheering on Xi Jinping as a great leader.
So during the campaign, I mean, Donald Trump was alleging that Biden was soft on China. And, there's all the Hunter Biden stuff as a backdrop. Is there any reason to believe, though, actually, that Joe Biden is soft on China, that he may sort of go backward on this?
So if you look at the record of a sort of standard Washington politician who was a senator and so on, for all the times that we were engaging in this strategy to welcome China in and help it, he was part of all that. So if you're just looking, if you a big break, and at the time that he left the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, or even when he was vice president, one could definitely say, look, he was part of the engagement consensus, and that could be a real problem. But during the campaign, it was clear that he had changed. Maybe it was political, seeing that the American people had changed on China, but he criticized China on human rights issues. His advisors said that we're going to be competing with China. I think there is some danger because of some of the domestic policies that Biden wants to prioritize, which will cost us a lot of money, could eat into defense budgets, will eat into defense budgets, national security budgets. There's always a danger when you say you want some deal with China, let's say on climate, that China will try to extract so many concessions from you on other issues. There's always a danger that if you telegraph your main goals to China and you say, I need this climate deal for domestic political reasons and other reasons, that China will start to ask us to stand down on the competition. There are dangers. It's not going to be easy going ahead.
All right. And on that note, it's a good place to stop. We have only teased, of course, all the stuff in this book, and everyone should get it. It's called The China Nightmare, The Grand Ambitions of a Decaying State. Dan, aside from getting the book, anything else we should know or that you want to plug?
Well, please buy the book. You can go on Amazon. It's coming out November 17th. And please continue to follow my writings. I'll be following Biden on China very carefully and seeing whether some of the things I said play out. How much does he keep this competition going? How does he position the United States to prevail versus what does he try to back off on a little bit for other priorities? So thank you very much, Matt, for giving me this opportunity to speak about the book and to speak about our policy going forward.
Yeah, no, it's a great conversation. And let me just say to the listeners out there, the best thing you can do for an author is pre-order the book. This one comes out in like 4 days. So order it today, and it'll be here in a couple days in the mail. And it is the best thing you can do for an author. Trust me, as someone who's written a book. So get it today. It's called The China Nightmare, The Grand Ambitions of a Decaying State. Dan Blumenthal, thank you for coming on the news.
Thank you so much, Matt.
If you like this podcast, rate and review it on iTunes. Follow Matt on Twitter at Matt K. Lewis. Thank you for listening to Matt Lewis and the News.